Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Anne-Marie Green, and of course, we begin with the story covering the front pages around the world. President Joe Biden will not run for re-election. The surprise announcement yesterday marks a historic and unprecedented moment in American politics. I know we keep saying this, but it is true. The election is just 105 days away. In a statement, President Biden said that his decision was in the best interest of the Democratic Party and the country, and he vowed to finish his term in office, the beginning of the end of a political career spanning 50 years. All eyes now are on Vice President Kamala Harris, who President Biden formally endorsed as his successor. If her party agrees, she will become the first woman of color to be nominated for the country's highest office. Well, CBS News polling shows Donald Trump leads Harris in a hypothetical matchup, but Harris polls higher than President Biden among younger voters and voters of color. CBS News correspondent Skyler Henry is tracking the developments from Capitol Hill. All right, Skyler, I want to talk a little bit about the timing here, the pros and the cons. Obviously, everything is going to be happening in an expedited manner, but could this timing help or hurt Harris?
These lenses. Let's start with pros first. Obviously, timing is on the vice president's side should she secure the nomination. The DNC says that they have a plan to set up some sort of framework over the course of the next few days in terms of figuring out how they want to move forward and on a united front. They also had plans, at least, for a virtual roll call, which would have happened on August 1st. In that instance, the vice president would ultimately be fast-tracked to become at the top of the ticket, of course, ruling out any other challengers, if you will. I think the cons, for one, is perception, right? I think many Democrats don't want this to appear as if there was any sort of political appointment, if you will, from President Biden with his endorsement. And so there's a bit of an open primary happening sort of behind the scenes, a mini primary, if you want to call it that, I think, with the vice president making phone calls to various groups, governors, members of Congress, labor leaders, and really trying to make her case. She even said during her statement yesterday that she wants to earn the support and vote of the Democrats who may be hesitant about having her at the top of the ticket. And that includes those who maybe have more progressive-leaning policies, those new Democrats, if you will. And just this morning, the largest Latino civil rights organization threw their support behind Vice President Harris. And so a lot of coalitions and a lot of groups saying that they want her to be at the top of this ticket. We'll see how effective that is as it relates to her nomination process.
Yeah, definitely. And before I let you go quickly, I'm pretty sure Donald Trump's team has already responded to this. What are we hearing?
Oh, yeah. Well, on one hand, the former president took every chance he could to slam Democrats as a whole, slammed President Biden, talking about how he's really not effective. And then it also went on to say that he doesn't really know if he wants to debate Vice President Harris should she become the Democratic nominee, saying instead that he wants to wait for this process to completely play out. We should point out, Anne-Marie, that he says that he feels confident that he would have a better chance at beating Vice President Harris than he would President Biden. We'll see what the polls have to say. We'll see, obviously, if he decides to get on that debate stage with the vice president should she become the nominee.
Yeah, because they did have another debate scheduled when, Biden was at the top of the ticket in September. So we'll see. Skyler, thank you.
You bet.
All right, now let's bring in CBS congressional correspondent Nikole Killion for reaction from Capitol Hill. Nikole, almost immediately, top Democrats came out supporting Harris after the president endorsed her. I want to play a clip.
I'm endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris because she's ready to step up, bring our party together, go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump, and win in November.
Vice President Harris is at the top of my list, and certainly she is at the lead right now of anyone I would endorse.
I think with Joe Biden as the heart and soul of our party and Kamala Harris coming out swinging against this ticket, we've got the recipe for victory.
All right, party leaders clearly signaling where they want other party members to go. What are you hearing from lawmakers? Is this messaging unanimous?
Well, look, I mean, I think as the vice president and her team have made clear, she wants to earn and win this nomination. So certainly there is some concern among some Democrats that they don't want this to be a coronation. But that being said, the vice president certainly has quite a bit of support from many members of Congress, not only rank and file, but a number of congressional leaders. And we know that she has reached out to many members of Congress. A source familiar says that she made over 100 calls, not only to members of Congress, but also other elected officials. For instance, we know that she had a call with Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries. She also spoke with leader Chuck Schumer, as well as the heads of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, as well as KPAC, which is also the Organization for Asian American Lawmakers. So she really is trying to do the work in terms of reaching out to members and shore up support to try to secure the party nomination.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes work that needs to be done really quickly. Part of that also has to do with Harris choosing a running mate. What are you hearing about possible VP picks?
Well, certainly we've heard a lot of names, whether that is Kentucky Governor Beshear, also Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Senator Mark Kelly potentially of Arizona, among others. But I also want to make clear, too, that we have heard that Senator Joe Manchin is also considering a potential presidential bid. So, again, unclear if she will face any challenge, but certainly being here on Capitol Hill, I think that is worth noting. You know, as far as the path forward, though, I think right now, just in talking to organizers, I think it really at this point is about trying to secure delegates for the vice president so that she is able to secure the nomination. Certainly, some have suggested having some kind of mini primary or open convention, but I think for those who are backing Harris, the hope is that she can secure enough delegates to get that nomination ahead of the convention if possible.
All right, Nikole Killion on Capitol Hill. Thank you so much, Nikole.
You bet.
So, Washington Post White House reporter Tyler Pager's joining us now to talk a little bit more about this sort of stunning developments over the weekend. So let's talk a little bit about Harris. One of the things that occurred to me is that, you know, she's the vice president, so people know her, but she's also the vice president, so people don't know her. Your job is to not outshine the president. So she's a known and unknown. She's not an incumbent, but she's going to have to defend Biden's record. What does she have to do now to reintroduce herself to voters?
Yeah, I think the next few days and weeks are going to be critical for Kamala Harris. As Nikole just said, there is not serious opposition to her quest to secure the Democratic nomination. We've already seen many state delegations vowed to support her in her bid, but she has the task of now running against Donald Trump. Her last presidential campaign was largely unsuccessful when she dropped out before votes were even cast ahead of the 2020 Democratic primaries. But I think one of the interesting things that Democrats will tell you is if you look at the merits of Joe Biden's record, the Biden-Harris administration, a lot of their policies are largely popular. One of the challenges President Biden faced was that people thought he himself was too old. So the challenge and the opportunity for Vice President Harris is trying to use that record and turn it into a strength. So I think we'll see her run largely on, the policies that the Biden-Harris administration passed over the last several years. But I think we'll also see her take a much more aggressive posture towards Donald Trump. I think one of the things that frustrated Democrats the most about Joe Biden's dismal debate performance last month in Atlanta is that he did not, he was unable to complete sentences at times, but more importantly, he wasn't able to take on Donald Trump. He didn't turn some of those questions into attack lines. Harris, obviously a former prosecutor, some Democrats are salivating at this contrast between a prosecutor and a convicted felon.
Totally. And you did some sort of really interesting reporting, I think, a few days ago about the possible VP pick. And you had reported that donors were already sort of funneling money into the vetting process for a possible vice presidential candidate. This is before the announcement. This is going to happen in a very expedited manner. It normally takes months to vet a VP pick. And sometimes even after months, you know, we get surprises. So can we talk a little bit more about sort of the challenges of having all of this unfold really, really rapidly?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, this is a process that normally takes many months because of the way that candidates and their teams want to scour everything about a candidate. Lawyers usually lead this process, going through all of the public statements that a candidate made, doing deep financial dives, personal dives, trying to find out everything about a candidate, potential vice presidential running mate, in part to figure out what could hurt them in a public campaign. When you pick a vice presidential running mate, there's a lot of attention and scrutiny of their record and of their past. And so these vetting processes are to try to avoid any embarrassing or potentially politically damaging information from coming out that they didn't know about ahead of time. We obviously just saw Trump complete his VP search process, and now we're going to start that all over again on the Democratic side, but under a very compressed timeline. In order to ensure that the full Democratic ticket is on all state ballot deadlines, they need to expedite this process. So, you know, Kamala Harris is focused right now on securing the nomination, but I would not be surprised if some of the lawyers in the Democratic Party start to quietly move ahead in beginning this vetting process.
Right. Tyler Pager, thank you very much.